Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. I'm sure a lot of you are still working out on what class that you're wanting to play for Classic, and of course, what race is always the next question. So I've been wanting to go over all 8 races in the game, their racials, and how they affect each class. Today, everything's pretty balanced, and it's more based on aesthetics and personal preference, but in Classic, the racials were much more impactful in general, I'd say, and they could have big implications for your gameplay in both PvP and PvE. At the end of the day, you should pick what you want. Some people like to go for looks or role-playing, and some people like to optimize things. This video is mainly for the latter. I think it'll still be useful to the more casual audience though, and shed some light on some of the more powerful combinations, especially if you missed vanilla and you're coming from the current crowd. So I'm not necessarily telling you what to pick. The main goal here is to arm you with the information for you to make that decision yourself. The way I'll split this up is class by class and give you my top picks for both PvE and PvP. Since I want to be pretty thorough here, I'll just do Alliance for this video, and I'll save Horde for the next part. Each race does have specific starting stats, which do have a minor impact. Here's a table showing all of them, courtesy of the vanilla World of Warcraft wiki. I'll have a link to that in the description. In the grand scheme of things, these aren't as impactful as the racials in my opinion. Like trolls have a higher agility than undead, but is 4 points really worth not being able to negate fear effects like an Onyxia or Magmadar to have that DPS uptime? I'll take these stats into consideration still, they just aren't that important to me because I put a high value in utility. So first, let's just take a broad look at all of the racials one by one to get a better understanding. You're going to see humans at the top of a lot of these lists, simply because they have really good racials for pretty much every class. We have Diplomacy, which is insanely good, especially for vanilla. 10% increased reputation gain. You want to be a Scepter Bearer? Go Human. You want your Eternal Quintessence sooner? Go Human. Classic World of Warcraft has a good amount of reputation grinds to do. The Argent Dawn, the Winter Saber Trainers, the PvP factions, although they're not out at release, and more. They're all very time consuming, and 10% can save you days and even weeks of farming. It makes this a very powerful racial, even through just raw numbers. Now, like I said, the PvP gear won't be out at launch, so this might vary depending on when you're watching this video, but these factions can give you some pretty good gear, and the faster you get it, the bigger impact it'll have on your damage, healing, or tanking. The only downside I can say really is that assuming that Classic never gets updated, it'll eventually be a dead racial once you're exalted with everything. We also have the Human Spirit, which is a 5% increase in spirit. Pretty self-explanatory here. It makes them regenerate health and mana more quickly, mainly useful for priests on the Alliance side though, not really for everyone else, as I'll explain in a bit. Gnomes are generally the better casters if you like to optimize things. We also have Perception, which is increased stealth detection for 20 seconds. Obviously a PvP oriented ability here, very useful across the board, but some classes get a little more benefit from it than others, as I'll explain later. And lastly, we have one of the best in the game for PvE, and that's their sword and mace specialization. Increased skill with swords and maces, both one-handed and two-handed, by 5. Vanilla World of Warcraft had something called weapon skill, and another stat called defense. There are also attacks called glancing blows, which are basically normal attacks that do less damage. The higher your weapon skill in comparison to a target's defense, the more damage you'll do through these glancing blows. That alone is a very noticeable difference, but it also affects your chance to hit and crit. A 0.04% increase in all of these stats per weapon skill above the defense skill of your target. There's a ton of math and equations that go behind it, and it's something that's become very confused and convoluted due to private servers calculating things incorrectly and sort of muddying the waters. To sum it up though, weapon skill is very important to have for any melee DPS class. Like I said, it can even change your best in slot list. There's a set of level 44 male gloves that non-human furry warriors consider to be best in slot for quite a while, simply due to the fact that they have increased weapon skill. That's how important it is. Anyways, next up we have the Dwarf. First, we have increased gun skill. Now, ranged weapon skill isn't as useful as melee weapon skill, simply due to the fact that there are no glancing blows for ranged weapons. You'll still get the added benefit of a higher chance to hit, but it's not anything huge. Some would even say negligible, and I'll go into further detail with that when we get to the Hunter. We also have Stone Form, which makes you immune to bleed, poison, and disease effects for 8 seconds, also increasing your armor by 10%. This is great to have in both PvE and PvP. In PvP, it clears things such as the Rogue's Crippling Poison, Along You to Kite, an Undead Priest's Devouring Plague, which is big, and in Classic, there are a bunch of really horrible diseases that lasted for a really long time. It was so bad that if I was on my Paladin in a major city back in the day, I'd get whispers all the time from diseased people asking me to cleanse them. So one of the best racials in my opinion. Note that there is a consumable in the game called the Jungle Remedy, which is sort of like a mini Stone Form. This cures just diseases and poisons, and it doesn't make you immune. Some people consider this as a half replacement to the racial, so you can sometimes sort of have the best of both worlds. For this video, I don't count consumables because really, there are a ton of other ones. Do invisibility potions count as a replacement to Shadow Meld? What about free action potions versus Escape Artist? It's too variable to consider all of this, so I think the best way to do it is to just assume it's an even playing field of just racials versus racials. If you want to consider consumables like this, I'll leave that up to you. Anyways, back on subject here. They also have plus 10 frost resistance, which is useful more for the final raid of vanilla, which is of course Nexramas, and also find treasure, which marks chests on your minimap. Kind of handy for gold making, but one thing that sucked about it is that you could only track one resource at a time, meaning that you'd have to choose between this or find herbs or mineral veins if you had herbalism or mining. And next up, we have the Gnome. First we have Escape Artist, which is escape the effects of any immobilization or movement speed reduction effect. A 0.5 second cast, and a 1 minute cooldown. This is pretty useful. I never really cared for the cast time. You can't use it on the move, and you're almost stunning yourself for half a second to clear a route or a slow. And PvP wise, a lot of the slows that you'll be worried about will be things like Crippling Poison or Frostbolt, and that's stuff that's applied over and over anyways. It doesn't have the benefit of Stone Form, where it not only clears it, but it also makes you immune for a short period. A good trade-off though is the much shorter cooldown, so it's still pretty powerful. Next we have Expansive Mind, which is a 5% intelligence increase. Intellect increases your mana and also your chance to crit, so this makes gnomes an appealing choice for casters in particular. They also get 15 more points in engineering, which is definitely handy considering it's probably the most expensive profession to level in vanilla. And lastly, they get 10 arcane resistance, which isn't too useful. For Classic, you really wanted either Fire, Nature, or Frost, since those are the most common spells in raiding. And Shadow for PvP. And this is kind of funny, but back in the day, when you hit water that was deep enough to swim in, it would knock you off of your mount. Since gnomes are the shortest race, they have the biggest trouble with this. There are rivers or spots that you can jump across no problem and stay on your mount with every other race, whereas the poor gnomes can struggle to keep up. Kind of silly, but I thought I'd mention it in case it mattered to some of you out there. And lastly for the Alliance, we have the Night Elves. Shadow Meld is a stationary stealth. It works just like the Druid or Rogue stealth, except it's a bit weaker with the fact that it fades when you move, and people can also see you from further away compared to the normal stealth. Also note that you can't use it in combat, unlike how it is now, but on the flip side, it only has a 10-second cooldown. More useful in PvP, as you'd imagine, getting the drop on people. PvP in vanilla isn't like today. Fights ended in a flash, so surprising and getting the opener on someone is hugely advantageous. It ensures that you get a charge off as a warrior, or maybe you're a hunter defending the flag room. You can also eat and drink while it's active, which is also very useful. We also have quickness, which is 1% dodge. Pretty handy for tanks in particular, which puts them at or near the top for protection warriors for a lot of people, although I think humans are generally picked due to that weapon skill. You also have the wisp form when dead, which increases your movement speed by 50%, arguably more useful in vanilla since you'll be dying more often, especially for that death run to Ironforge if you plan on doing that. And lastly, they get 10 nature resistance, mainly handy for AQ40 here for Huhuran and a couple of other fights. So those are all of the racials. By now, you might have a basic idea of where these really shine for what classes, but let's go over them one by one, starting with the rogue. Talking swords here, humans obviously for that weapon skill, but honestly, it's not as powerful as it could be for the rogue. And that's because of their weapon expertise talent, which increases your skill with swords, fists, and daggers by 5 with 2 points. You do still get benefit, but there are some diminishing returns at higher weapon skill levels. I think it's somewhere around a 2% DPS change, partly due to the fact that your best offhand changes from the Hunger and Cold or Maladath, which increases your sword skill, to something like Iblis, which turns out better for humans due to the stats, versus that diminished benefit from weapon skill. For me, I still keep them on top because it is still an increase, and that reputation bonus is still big. And I know I mentioned it, but don't get too caught up in best in slot lists because remember, we're getting progressive raids. So I talk about the Blackwing Lair and Exramus, but it'll be a while before they're even available, so try not to worry about that stuff too much. Dwarves take second, mainly because I value Stoneform quite a bit. Being able to clear some of those AQ40 poisons or a bleed for a clean vanish is pretty handy. Night Elves do take third for me. As a rogue or a druid, you do get a stealth boost from Shadow Meld, and it's pretty major. It makes pickpocketing or just stealthing through dungeons much easier, plus the dodge is always a nice bonus for solo play. And gnomes come in fourth for me. Talking escape artist here, with proper talents you can already clear roots and snares with sprint and vanish anyways. I'm of the opinion of making your weak points stronger, not buffing yourself in areas that you already excel in. For PvP, I like Dwarf first because of their stone form pretty much. Like I mentioned, you can use this to get a clean vanish off, which is really useful against rogue vs rogue, or any class with poisons or bleeds for that matter. It even clears blind, since that's a poison as well, which is another huge advantage. Like I said, Stoneform is an amazing racial in Classic. It was only nerfed years later in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion because Death Knights were complaining that they couldn't kill dwarves. All their damage was dependent on having diseases on their target, so that's when they finally saw the nerf bat. But it's back to its overpowered self in Classic, which is a good thing for Alliance players. Humans are also nice because Perception as a rogue has a higher value for me. You know the old saying in vanilla, what classes can beat a rogue? Well, a better rogue of course, and anyone who's played one will know that rogue vs rogue is all about who gets the opener. For players of equal skill and gear, the opener always wins if you play things right, so Perception, which is usable in stealth, is hard for me to beat in PvP. Also of course handy for druids trying to sneak a flag pickup in the Warsong Gulch. Plus, when those PvP factions come out, the faster you get that gear the better, so I do also consider diplomacy here. Gnomes do take third for me. Like I mentioned, I don't like escape artists for rogue because we already have great mobility, but in the PvP scene, you gotta bump it up a bit. As strong as rogues are, they're really cooldown dependent, so if this can save you from burning a vanish or a sprint, that's still really handy. And Night Elves are trailing behind here at number 4 for me. Shadow Meld, as I recall, is about equal in power to Perception. I personally like Perception for Rogue vs. Rogue since it increases your detection rather than increasing your stealth, so you're not just wandering around mashing cheap shot as much. But on the flip side, Shadow Meld does have the advantage of being useful against everything else, such as Warlocks and their invisibility detection. They're good, I just like the other racials more for PvP. And as for daggers, humans do get bumped down a bit since they no longer get that benefit from weapon skill. I imagine if you want to optimize things PvE wise, you're gonna be combat swords, but I just thought I'd mention it to be thorough. Next up, we have the warrior. Here are my lists, whether you're two-handed or dual-wielding. Like I said, you'll see human at the number 1 spot for a lot of classes since that weapon skill is so good. Even more so for warriors since they don't have any talents that increase it. And the rest is basically the same reasons for rogue and PvE. I have dwarves at number 2 because Stoneform is so good, and I do have gnomes above night elves because I think escape artist is a little more valuable as a warrior since they don't have as many mobility tools as a rogue. It could help for some fights. And on the PvP side of things, once again, I like dwarves the most for that stone form, so you can kite rogues, and get a free intercept basically, since you can go immune to crippling poison. Keep devouring plague off you, since shadow priests are probably one of the best 1 vs. 1 classes in the entire game, and so on. Gnomes take second for me. Being able to clear a Frost Nova or a Wind Clip root is nice as a warrior, so really, either of those are great choices I think. Third place is a tough choice for me, but I go with human personally. I like popping rogues out of stealth I guess, so I like Perception over Shadow Meld here. But I think what puts it over the edge for me is that reputation bonus. There's some good play from both the Arathi Basin and the Warsong Gulch reputations, which is sort of an indirect buff since you'll get it sooner as a human. For tanking, you have a few choices here. I think human is sort of agreed to be number 1 due to that increased weapon skill for more rage and threat generation, and considering that Thunder Fury is like the holy grail of tanking weapons, it lines up perfectly. I didn't tank back in the day, but I think warriors started to have rage generation problems as they got geared up since they weren't taking as much damage. So because of this and their other bonuses, I have them as number 1 for the Alliance. Night Elves take second place for me due to their 1% dodge, and also nature resistance, which is notable for AQ40. Dwarf is third for me. You do get 10% armor from Stoneform, plus the debuff clears and some frost resistance. It's more situational though, whereas humans and night elves get their bonuses in pretty much every situation. And gnomes come in last. The only positive thing you can say really is escape artist, but I mean if you're tanking, you're probably going to have a paladin in your raid, so any movement speed or root is a non-issue anyway since they have Blessing of Freedom, or just dispels in general. And the last thing you want to do while tanking is to cast something, which makes you unable to dodge or parry. So they take a distant fourth for me. Next, we have the Paladin, usually relegated to healing in the PvE scene, but I thought I'd cover DPS as well because why not? Human is a clear winner here for that weapon skill, especially for Retribution Paladins since they're so dependent on auto attacks anyways. You really can't beat that in my opinion. I say the same thing for PvP as well, and that's because the Dwarf Stoneform isn't as vital as a Paladin I think. You can already cleanse poisons and diseases, and you have Blessing of Freedom for any movement and parrying abilities. Again, I like covering weak points instead of adding to strengths, so having that Perception against rogues and druids and night elves and duels is a nice bonus. For healing, your first thought is probably human for that bonus spirit, but it's not as big of a bonus as you'd think, since I think paladins got most of their mana from crits via talents. The reason why I said this is more catered to priests earlier is because not counting mana per 5, you're locked out of regenerating mana as a caster unless you don't cast something for 5 seconds. It's called the 5-second rule, and priests get around this via the meditation talent, and they also have another one that gives them some spell damage and healing through spirit, so because of this, spirit in general is much more valuable to them. Paladins, on the other hand, don't really have any bonuses like that. The weapon skill as Holy is also pretty limited if you're going to be healing, so either human or dwarf I say, they're pretty even. Really, for healing, you should just go for the utility ratios rather than the numbers. If you want more reputation and perception, go human, and if you want stone form, go dwarf. You can also tank as a paladin, depending on your standard for the word. Like I said, warriors were the tanks in vanilla. I think the most the paladins tanked really were 5-mans, and maybe a few odd fights here and there. Like maybe the Twin Emperors due to their spell effects. Don't quote me on that one though. I'd say human once again for the weapon skill, but I'm afraid I'm not much help here. Sorry. Anyways, next up we have the Mage. 2 choices here, Gnome or human. The impactful ratios for the Gnome are 5% intellect, which boosts your mana and crit, and also escape artist, which is just an added bonus. Whereas humans, we have spirit, which is pretty negligible for caster DPS in comparison to that bonus intellect. For PvP, I think it's another one you can go either way with without too much regret. It's basically perception versus escape artist and some intellect. It really depends on how much you fear rogues, I guess. If you want a more all-around useful racial, escape artist is the way to go. Personally, I prefer perception over escape artist in this case. But then again, you also have that bonus intellect. Like I said, for PvP, it's a tough choice. I guess I'd pick Gnome if you forced me to choose though. Next, we have the Hunter. For both PvE and PvP, my choice is Dwarf, again for that stone form. Having that gives you an ace up your sleeve against rogues, which is doubly important for hunters because remember, they have that dead zone. If something gets too close to you, you can't shoot it. So anything to keep people at range is extremely valuable for PvP. Plus, as a hunter, one of your jobs will be to take down shadow priests with your mana drain, so having stone form against undead with their devouring plague will work wonders for you, and it's still useful in PvE as I discussed. Night Elves can do some pretty nifty things in PvP with Feign Death and Shadow Meld, and if you get a stealth pet, you can really catch people off guard if you're guarding a flag in the Arathi Basin or Warsong Gulch. To me though, I just think that stone form is too strong to pass up if you want to optimize things. As for the dwarves plus gun skill, like I mentioned earlier, ranged attacks don't glance, so they don't get as huge of a benefit as compared to melee weapon skill. They still get added bonus from the increased chance to hit and whatnot, but it's not really a huge deal. Plus, add to the fact that a majority of the hunter's best weapons are bows and crossbows anyways, just takes away from it even more. Most of you will be using Rockdalar for a while, since the quest starter is a 50-50 chance from the Major Domo fight, thus pretty easy to get, and after that, the main upgrades are crossbows or other bows as far as I recall. And you wouldn't really think it, but even the sound of guns is a big turnoff for a lot of people. It's not like today, where it sounds like a stapler. It's a musket, and it can wear on some people, especially if you're raiding for a few hours. It doesn't really bug me, but I thought I'd just throw it out there for you. Night Elves do have their pluses as well. Like you saw in that table, they have a high base agility, which is of course the main stat for hunters, and like I said, Shadow Meld is great for PvP and getting the drop on people. Really, I think this is another one that you could go either way with without too much regret. I just like dwarves because I like Stoneform so much. Plus, they can bench more. Winding down here though, just a few more to go. Next up, we have the Warlock. Choices are Gnome and Human, just like the Mage, and it's a lot of the same reasoning. Gnome is the go-to for PvE for that 5% intellect. It dwarfs that spirit in comparison, especially considering that Warlocks generate mana through life tapping anyways. Which, if you have more mana, you'll even save some global cooldowns. And on the PvP side of things, you can already detect stealth as a Warlock, which lessens the value of perception in my opinion. As for Escape Artist, this gets a little more value compared to my logic with mages. Getting a fear off and clearing any hindering effects will definitely be handy. And lastly, we have the Priest. I saved this one for last because it's a bit of a special case. One of the cool RPG elements back in the day was that priests got special abilities that depended on their race, and in general, these eclipsed the normal racials for Alliance in my opinion. You have 3 choices here: Human, Dwarf, and Night Elf. Let's just go over the special abilities first. Humans get Desperate Prayer, which is an instant self-heal at a 10-minute cooldown, and with no mana cost. You also get Feedback, which is a defensive mana drain with some damage. Lasts for 15 seconds at a 3-minute cooldown. Dwarves have the same Desperate Prayer and also Fear Ward, which makes your target immune to the next fear, with a 30-second cooldown and 10-minute duration. And Night Elves get Elune's Grace, which reduces your ranged damage taken, and gives you 10% dodge for 15 seconds with a 5-minute cooldown. And Star Shards, which is a channeled arcane damage spell. The highlight out of all of these is this spell right here. You may have even heard of how good this was, even if you never played Classic. It was so good in fact that in patch 2.3, Blizzard made it available to all races. It was way too imbalanced. Fear Ward by far is the best priest racial for the Alliance, so much so that it even used to guarantee you raid spots. It didn't matter how poorly geared or unskilled you were. If you were capable of pressing this button, come on in. This was so useful to have for both PvE and PvP. The Onyxia fear becomes a non-issue for your tank, the Magmadar fear, and plenty of others I'm sure I'm not thinking of. And combining that with Stoneform just makes them way too powerful in my eyes. For those wanting the absolute best mana regeneration, Human is a good choice for that 5% spirit. I talked about this during the Paladin section, but I'll say it again just in case you've been skipping through the video. Not counting mana per 5, you're locked out of regenerating mana as a caster, unless you don't cast something for 5 seconds. Priests have a talent called Meditation that gets around this, which allows for a little bit of mana regeneration even through casting, and another one that gives you spell damage and healing based on spirit. So with the 5% bonus, you do see some added benefit from Humans. Some people think that trumps Fear Ward, but personally, I'm Dwarf all the way. As for the other racials, the runner-up here is Desperate Prayer in terms of usefulness. No mana cost, which is notable, so just an all-around oh crap button to have, which is really handy. And the other ones are just little buffs that are pretty negligible in comparison. Star Shards isn't that useful because it's arcane damage. If you're a Shadow Priest, you want that shadow damage obviously. And Feedback and Elune's Grace are just kinda little buffs to throw on. Too short of durations and too long of cooldowns to really be that useful in my opinion. PvP healing, I have the same idea here. Utility over everything, although do note that Fear Ward is a magic effect and it can be dispelled, so it's not all powerful. I also have the same with PvP DPS and PvE DPS. Guilds sometimes take one Shadow Priest for their Shadow Weaving debuff. I'm a believer that this time around things will be easier since these raids have been out for 14 years, and therefore guilds will be more lax and they'll take some of the lesser use specs more often. So with that and Fear Ward, you'll be quite the valuable member in a raid, even if you don't do the most damage. And lastly, we have the toughest choice, and that's the Druid. I know a lot of you struggle with this one, so here's my list for each category. I'll leave you to guess why I made these decisions. But anyways, that's about it for the Alliance. Again, at the end of the day, you should pick what you want. If you really like Arthas and you want to be just like him, make that Human Paladin. Or maybe you were like me, and you thought that Dwarf Hunter in the cinematic was really cool, so you'll pick him. Just think carefully, because there aren't any race changes this time around. This'll be the character you'll be spending 60 levels with. Again, this video isn't saying you must pick these races. The main goal was to shed some light on things that maybe you didn't know about. I know a lot of you are probably coming from the current game and you skipped Classic, so maybe you didn't know about stuff like weapon skill or the priest racials, so hopefully you gained some insight by watching this. Hopefully I hit all of the highlights. It has been over 11 years for me. If I have any corrections, I'll have a pinned comment for you to check out. If you have any suggestions yourself, post them in the comments, and read through them as well, as I'm sure there'll be some helpful information in there. I should be back soon with the Horde video. I'll post it in the description whenever I get around to that if you favor that faction. I hope you found the video helpful, like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.